Do we have any questions from the audience for any of the speakers?
Wait.
The line forms. I have only 7 questions, but I'll ask 2. So the first question for our last speaker, and the context for the question is that many of the principles that you've outlined that have their origin in the Silver Book are already embedded in Canada's federal regulatory policy, if not in identical language. They're largely there. But we, on the industry side of the table, sometimes encounter prolonged speculation on the part of risk assessors, speculation that falls outside of the range of what we know or should even speculate on. Is there a principle found within that Silver Book or in your analysis that provides guidance as to when do we stop speculating and put the decision in the hands of a risk decision maker? Are there any guidelines around that? And my second question, just before I forget it, is a clarification for Dr. South.
Terrific question, because risk assessments can go on for quite a long time. People enjoy just do that. Is this on?
Yeah. Yep. You'll have to hold it.
Stopping points.
Real close. Hold it close. Because it,
yeah. There should be stopping points. And there are some good criteria for deciding the kind of analysis you need to do, how to do it. Other reports from the National Academy on that particular question. Integration, is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. Data integration and all of that. Mm-hmm. I mean, but there is not a clear rule about a stopping point, but there always should be. That you've analyzed the data and you've taken it as far as you can. Mm-hmm. The remaining uncertainties you can't deal with, but they should be laid out mm-hmm. and then passed on to the decision maker. But it should be a process which has defined, not rigidly defined time limits, but it should have limits. But there's no guidance in the Silver Book about that. No.
Okay. Historically, I recall that in the U.S. you've applied significant scientific agreement processes to resolve those prolonged assessment conundrums. Is that still in place in the U.S.? I don't know.
I don't think so. I don't know that term. PA in particular, and FDA, right. At least in parts of FDA, a lot of the groups,
right.
And those peer review groups, scientific peer review groups, make a decision about whether the work is adequate and should cease, or whether they should go back and do more.
Okay.
But I don't know anything about that phrase in the U.S. I might just not have knowledge.
It was applied in food additive approvals on more than one occasion, but a long time ago in the 90s. My second question is actually a question of clarification. In your presentation, looking at section 402A1, where you had the 2 obligations of the US FDA to determine what needs to be done for something that is deliberately added or not deliberately added, you said, I heard you say, that mycotoxins are treated as substances that are added as opposed to those that are not added. Was that a slip of the tongue, or did you really say that?
I believe I did say that.
Okay. That seems to be at odds with what we heard from your colleague on Monday and the way you've approached mycotoxins specifically.
You know, I think that was a mistake.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Because we've based only 5 years of lobbying on it, so I'm glad to hear it was a mistake.
I can add a point on that, though,
yes.
Because that same issue existed when I was at FDA.
Yeah.
Because we were trying to find the legal category. That's
right.
a different matter. And there was a notion, they're definitely not intentionally added, and nobody does that. But the notion was that since they are, some practices could avoid them, they are at least added in that sense.
Okay.
But that's kind of a legal definition.
Yeah, it's vitally important because we don't have that discretion in the Canadian law. I've raised this over and over again and asked the question on Monday about it. We don't have such language in the Federal Food and Drugs Act, and it has consequences for working through things like this and the application of discretion and actually case-by-case risk assessment. So thank you for the clarification and also for your answers. Thank you.
My name is Johan de Meester from Cargill. I had a number of questions to some of your good contributions. So my first question is to Dr. Rodrigues. So in one of your closing remarks, I had a little bit of a problem with your second thought that during food processing, let's say mycotoxin risks are increasing. Because I think we have here also in one of the first sessions a number of holistic approaches whereby supported by EU funding, like the MycoRed and the My Toolbox approach, where as Cargill is doing, we have a number of crop analysts who are looking very well into what's in the world, how the crops would look like. And then we try to decide what would be the best consignments based on, for instance, low in pesticide, low in GMO, low in mycotoxins, and then bring it to the customer. And also I think there is also, crops are traded, but also a number of crops are also processed, and they are processed in a way to lower the risk. I agree with your agreement, with your thinking that indeed, if you do dry milling, that you have to take precautions in reducing the exposure to workers or to employees to that. But I have a little bit of a problem with that because I think there is a lot is reasonably done in the food processing industry to reduce the risk of mycotoxins in the end.
Yeah, I didn't mean to say that anything going on to intervene and to try to reduce risk is increasing it. I don't know that. It might. All I'm saying is you have to consider that possibility.
Okay.
I don't know enough about mycotoxins to make that claim. Yeah.
Then I had a question for Dr. South. It seems that there are no regulatory, and I must to give my notes because you have action limits, you have guidance values, but for zearalenone you don't have them in the US, it seems. For zearalenone you don't have.
That's correct. We actually look at that mycotoxin on a case-by-case basis. So when we are alerted to levels in products, we review the amount found, what food it's being found in, and then look at that issue on a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
So that is correct.
Yeah. Then I a couple of questions for Dr. Wu. So in your presentations, also in this session, but also in a previous one, I saw that you were looking at the effect of aflatoxins in maize as an approach, how that would influence the export or the trade flow. You said today that in 2007 you saw that it had riots in 22 nations. In 2012, around this period, we had a sudden drought in the US. Did you also look at that time, at that occasion, how that influences the trade?
Yes, we did, in fact. So it's interesting that you mentioned that. We just published a paper on that last month in Food Additives and Contaminants, that there was indeed a problem with drought and high heat in 2012 in the United States. And the cost associated with aflatoxin in corn, we just did an analysis in the United States that year. It was quite a bit higher, and it wasn't necessarily because there were many bushels that were above 20 parts per billion, the FDA action level for aflatoxin in food, rather that the testing costs then increased because because it was recognized that the problem was existing even in the all the way up to the upper Midwest. And so now there was the requirement to do a lot of testing for batches for aflatoxin, and those increased sampling and testing costs really drove up the cost in that year.
Okay, thank you.
I lied. I had 3 questions.
Okay, you can have one more.
Would any speaker care to comment on the concept that regulatory maximum limits are of interest where we have them and can establish them, but like advisory levels or thresholds of concerns, they serve more effectively as incentives to do things better as opposed to being really effective tools for reducing dietary exposure. So that's a contention on my part. They're useful, but I love the theme that came out at this conference, that we need to look at a lot of things beyond maximum limits, because maximum limits alone do not serve to effectively reduce mycotoxins in many cases. So anybody have a further comment on that? Like the idea or not? Yeah.
If I may jump in, and anybody else who wants to add to that, two thoughts on that. One of our colleagues, Dr. Chris Wild, the director of IARC, once said, when we were preparing that IARC report, what gets measured gets managed. So there are certainly all kinds of limitations and issues with how these maximum regulatory levels are set, but if we don't set any level whatsoever, then there's really not as much of an incentive to measure, and it's absolutely crucial for public health that we do measure these. And the second thought is that, and I didn't have the chance to go into it in this particular talk, that after the rejections by the EU of the Iranian pistachio consignments in 1997, the other really important impact of regulatory limits, and you alluded to this in your question, is technology forcing. That they substantially improved their post-harvest treatment of pistachios after that 1997 embargo on pistachios. And as a result, the aflatoxin levels decreased substantially in Iranian pistachios. So there's an absolute benefit in that regard.
Right.
Well, I can't talk about the export part of it, but for domestic trade, the experience that we have is that farmers who wants to meet the market and the standards in the market, what they would often do is not sell everything in the market, but keep some for the home consumption. And thereby, they basically also improve the food safety of the local population on the home consumption as well. But that depends on different countries. Like, for example, what we see in Nigeria, for example, the experience is that although the farmers can get in between 13 and 17% more incentive in the market, they were not selling everything, but they were actually keeping about 25 to 40% for home consumption or for community distribution.
Right.
So it does actually impact on the local food safety as well.
Right. I would observe one thing, and then I'll sit down forever, I promise. So one of the outcomes of what gets measured gets managed in the North American context is that if we bring forward, after careful consideration, advice or guidance to industry that is not, in effect, is not actually a regulatory, legally enforceable limit, the marginal propensity of industry, the food industry in North America, is to adopt that guidance as being the equivalent of being legally enforceable. And as a consequence, there are often new constraints posed on the supply chain arising from interim guidance or an action level or something as straightforward as the US FDA guidance on DON, for example. That's been observed religiously by processors more and more in recent years. So I agree that they serve as an incentive, but I think there can be adverse consequences if we're not taking into account practical achievability in some cases.
Yeah, just to say, yeah, quickly, I agree completely. I do think, I agree with my other speakers that they are useful, and using the kind of methodology that I outlined, they can give you some assurance that your dietary exposure in your population, based on how people consume foods, because they don't normally take into account things like mycotoxin occurrence, you get some assurance that the exposure in the population is below some level. Now, to Joe's point about that level not being really telling you a whole lot about risk in actual terms, I think that's where we need to move towards from a regulatory point of view, but we're far from it at the moment. But ultimately, if you can get to that kind of place and you have a broader regulatory acceptance of a more mature acceptance of what risk and low risk actually means, I think they can be useful. But I take your point as well.
Thank you.
I was going to say the same thing. I mean, I absolutely agree. They're absolutely necessary. I wouldn't doubt that in a moment. One, they don't do much to solve the whole problem, though. Much more work is needed to be done. Risk assessment can be helpful in other stages of the problem solving. That is, looking at the effects of mitigation, where you're getting the most benefit. And the only criticism I would add to the regulatory numbers, those standards or action levels, is what do they tell us about risk? There is an obligation, it seems to me, to understand what the risk is when you're putting those into effect. What risk do you think remains, and is it low enough? Questions like that, I think, should be answered.
Thank you very much.
And I also note in Codex Alimentarius, with MLs, and these are regulatory levels, these are voluntary. Before establishing MLs, Codex generally, or the CCCF, tries to, develops a code of practice and sees whether or not a code of practice can address the issue. And then only after that, if there is an issue with levels still, then they would work further to a discussion paper for developing MLs for contaminant. Good.
Sorry, I just wanted to add to that. One of the challenges, or one of the discussions we had when we were working on the Dawn review paper was in the toxicology section of the paper. Because if you refer back to the previous JECFA assessments on dietary exposure, it was based on, I think it's a 2006 cluster, food clusters, and yet there's a more recent cluster from 2012, I think it is, which actually changes some of the information that's available as to types of foods in different regions. And after the Codex decision, there was a discussion or a problem in trade between the US and a South American country. In fact, it wasn't just between the US, it was between Canada as well. This country had gone ahead and implemented the EU level for Dawn, which was considerably below the level that they'd been using for their trade contracts. And what happened was that no one would fill the contracts. So they were it was a sort of crisis point. Their flour mills couldn't buy flour, and they needed a particular type of flour, and the US and the Canadian traders would not actually meet the contracts. And subsequently, after some discussion and some reviews, and we actually spent some time with them pointing out the difference between our supply chains and why, and to Alicia's type of things where like countries trade, they'd essentially broken that line, and subsequently it went back to their original level when they realized that they didn't have some of the same issues, they didn't have some of the same consumption data. And in the conversations we had, several people said, well, we don't actually know how to submit data to the consumption data. There's a communication issue there between many of the smaller countries or countries who don't have really active codex activities where these requests for consumption data go out. So it's not just the analytical data that might be missing and needed, sometimes it's consumption data that's not available and puts some extra breaks in the chain. But it was just something that sort of came to mind in terms of doing your risk assessments. If you're using different cluster groups, they might actually not be as current or as well data rich as they could be.
This has to do more in terms of the developing world concept. In many countries, you do have the maximum levels, and sometimes they enforce it. But the mitigation plans, in terms of the commodities, the commodity that don't meet that standard, what happens to it? That is something that is not actually taken into consideration. It's very common that sometimes the Ministry of Health in a country would go in and monitor the contamination levels in home foods or in the market. And then they would say, this grain cannot be traded. But what happens to that grain is not actually, it's not followed up on. So oftentimes, it just leaks into some other sector. Okay? So the food basically remains in the same, in the human system itself, but it's not taken out. So sometimes, I don't know whether having the MLs without having the proper mitigation plans, or whether it's without the proper implementation plans, whether that helps or it actually hurts.
Thank you. My name's Greg Brory. I'm with Tox Strategies. And Anne, my ears pricked up when I saw the slide on GMOs, because in the U.S. there's just hysteria over GMOs, and it's all about using Roundup, what have you. So I'm just curious, sort of your perspective, crossing between the U.S. and Australia. You know, how can we help people sort of distinguish GMOs as a means more than just, you know, herbicides, and it can actually be something that's really, you know, really helpful in protecting people?
Do you have all afternoon? I suspect that I probably have a very biased view on this. And when you say that there's hysteria, there might be among some journalists, but and perhaps some action groups. I think that probably below the surface there's rather practical, and it's causing some issues. The issues have to be resolved. It's perhaps driving the US and supply chain to a more practical, more transparent approach. So I'm not sure that there's a simple answer to your question, and probably not one that I want to be quoted on. So I think I'd probably prefer to just leave it there. I think there's opportunities there. There's no question about that. But there's so much. You know, the internet has a wonderful way of delivering information. It also has a wonderful way of delivering misinformation. And Google doesn't determine whether information is correct or not. So I think we've got to put our own filters on this and sort of be responsible as we go forward.
Just a quick response from a European perspective, where we possibly don't have a very healthy attitude to GM foods in terms of having an informed, science-based dialogue about it. And I definitely feel that one of the issues comes from the regulatory framework that we have. I don't think it's a very science-based regulation framework. And I teach part of a course actually in GM food risk assessment that's given to member state experts as part of a system called Better Trained Safe Food. So it's to try and increase expertise at a competent authority level in Europe. And I teach a module in exposure assessment. And I built my career on the importance of exposure assessment and risk analysis. But it's the most pointless module I've ever taught. And I hate to say that publicly, but I feel like doing it, so I will. There's no hazard ever been identified with GM foods for human health. Therefore, there's no reason to do an exposure assessment, yet it's mandated at a regulatory level. So I think until, whatever about the public perception of GM foods, which is a much harder thing to battle, unless you have a regulatory science-based framework that actually reflects the true situation and you show strong leadership at that level, I think you'll always fail, because people will have a much greater perception of risk as a result, even if it's at that endemic level, at a regulatory level, whatever about the things that we learn through social media incorrectly, that if it's there at a regulatory level, you're always going to be on the back foot. I think that's my perspective on it.
One quick point on that, there's now close to 20 years of evidence that transgenic BT corn has lower levels of mycotoxins. The work started from Iowa State University in terms of BT corn reducing fumonisin levels, and now the BT corn events that we have, Viptera, VT Pro, they can reduce aflatoxin as well, because they control better for corn earworm and fall armyworm. And yet, whenever I've made that particular presentation, a certain company said to me, well, the reason we don't want to get this message out to the public is because then people will know that there's mycotoxins in the food. And the moment that you let people know that there are mycotoxins in the food, there's going to be widespread panic. What is this thing called a mycotoxin? And they didn't even want to go there. even if they didn't put the mycotoxins there. So, yeah, they just wanted to avoid that altogether.
Yeah, I think we're done. So we're off to the end of the break, and I think it's lunchtime. Thanks everyone for coming and attending the session. I'm sure our speakers will be around for a little bit, so if anyone has further questions.